Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about modernism. We've talked about how society is changing during the 1920s, that American society is embracing traditional American ideas of freedom in more radical ways than they have been before, especially in the area of sexual relations. Modernism is kind of the broader cultural base for this change that's taking place. And it's very much linked to the technological innovations of the 19th century and the devastation of World War I in the early 20th century. And we see in particular modernism, these ideas of modernism demonstrated in art and literature in America during this period, during the period of the 20s. World War II has destroyed confidence in traditional society and traditional social values. When men and women in America in the 20s look at traditional values and look at World War I and look at the devastation of World War I, they think, why should we trust the values of a society that gave us so much death and so much misery? And so there's a sense that traditional values don't really work. And then you combine that with the advances in technology that are happening all around these people. And they see that so much is changing and so much is new, and they extend this approach to morality. If you see that so much is changing and so much is new, why couldn't morality, why couldn't society have a similar approach? That there would be new approaches to morality that could be better, that could be an improvement on traditional practices. And so, but there, at the same time, as you have this rejection of the old, there's an uncertainty about the new. What should new attitudes towards the world, towards society, towards morality, what should those actually look like? And modernism is really an act of despair or bewilderment when faced with that question. So we find these three key principles of modernism. Firstly, that God does not exist. Second, that reality is not rational, is not ordered, is not obvious. And third, that after World War I, social progress could no longer be assumed. This was the cultural perspective that we see in the 19th century and in the Enlightenment. Follow Enlightenment principles, and you'll see human society continue to get better. But the end of that, after a century of doing that, is World War I. So that doesn't seem to work. But what modernism says is not those principles didn't work, here are some new principles. It says there are no principles. Reality is not something that we can understand. There are no principles by which we should live in this society. And so that's the answer that artists and thinkers and philosophers and writers have come up with in America in the 20s, but they don't particularly like that answer. It's not a positive realization. Again, the sentiment that I would say best describes it is bewilderment. We see this in the writings of leading modernist thinkers in the United States at this time. Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, who wrote The Waste Land. Their writings both demonstrate this kind of rootlessness, this kind of uncertainty about we live in this world that's changing very rapidly, but we don't really know what's the best way to live in it. We don't really know whether there is a best way to live in this new world. Other writers like Ernest Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald presented themselves as representatives of the lost generation, a generation that had been lost through fighting in World War I. But these were those who had survived. And they survived and found that people didn't really care about the world that they felt that they were fighting to save. This wasn't a world that people believed in anymore. And so there's that type of angst that we see in modernism as well. And we see this reflected in art of the time. This is why modern art has the stereotype that it does of being meaningless. That art was no longer seen as necessarily being able to convey what the world really was. It was just conveying a particular perspective. And that art, in the words of one artist, art should disturb. That art shouldn't be something that says, yep, you think that grass looks like this, you think that trees look like this. This is showing you how beautiful those ideas are. This is affirming those ideas. The modernist approach to art, the approach to modern art, says we don't know whether we see the same thing when we look at grass and trees. So we're not going to even try and depict that. We're going to depict what the mind of the artist thinks when they think about grass and trees. Do you see how it's a step removed? There isn't the same confidence that everyone in the world is looking at the same thing. Instead, there's this uncertainty that's characteristic of the modernist change to American culture during the 1920s.